You think you can just sit there, Stephen, with that smug grin, tearing into my life's work like it's some cheap punchline for your late-night circus? Nicolas Cage's voice thundered through the studio, his eyes blazing with a fury that could melt steel. The audience, expecting another polished segment of banter, froze in their seats, their gasps swallowed by the electric tension. Stephen Colbert, perched behind his desk, leaned back with a smirk that oozed condescension, his fingers drumming a lazy rhythm on the polished wood. The stage, a sleek battlefield of egos, crackled with the promise of chaos. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of Nicolas Cage's latest film, a gritty drama about a war veteran's redemption. But Stephen had other plans. He'd opened the interview with a barbed jab, calling the movie a tired retread of Cage's over-the-top style, a cheap shot that cut deeper than any critic's review. Now Nicholas stood, his chair shoved back, fists clenched, ready to unleash a storm. What kind of man invites a guest just to humiliate him? Nicholas demanded, his voice low but sharp, each word a dagger aimed at Stephen's ego. The audience, caught in the crossfire, shifted uneasily, sensing this wasn't scripted. Stephen's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with the thrill of control. "Oh, Nick, come on, I'm just having a bit of fun," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Isn't that what you do? Overact for a paycheck?" The crowd's murmur grew louder, a mix of shock and delight at the audacity. Nicholas took a step forward, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "You think you know me? You think you can sum up 30 years of my craft in one snide quip?" His voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of a career spent pouring his soul into every role, only to be mocked by a man who'd never faced a camera's unblinking judgment. The argument's roots lay in a misunderstanding, twisted by Stephen's ambition to boost ratings. Nicholas had arrived expecting a serious discussion about his film, a project he'd spent years developing, pouring his heart into a story of sacrifice and redemption. But Stephen, hungry for viral moments, had seen an opportunity. He'd heard whispers of Nicholas's financial struggles from years past, debts long settled but still fodder for tabloids. Stephen decided to poke that wound, framing it as a joke about Nicholas's choice of roles. "Why do you keep churning out these B-movies, Nick? Trying to pay off another castle?" he'd asked, chuckling as the audience tittered. The jab wasn't just rude. It was personal, a deliberate strike at Nicholas's pride. Stephen knew it would provoke, and he leaned into it, craving the chaos that would keep viewers glued to their screens. Nicholas's chest heaved as he stared down his host. "You don't get to judge me, Stephen. You sit here night after night, hiding behind your desk, throwing darts at people who actually create something." The crowd erupted in applause, some standing, drawn to Nicholas's raw defiance. Stephen's smile faltered just for a moment, before he recovered with a laugh that sounded forced. "Oh, Nick, you're so dramatic. Isn't that your brand? Over the top, larger than life, Nicolas Cage?" He leaned forward, his voice sharp now, cutting through the cheers. "Maybe if you picked better scripts, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The audience gasped again, the air thick with anticipation. Nicholas's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he took another step toward the desk. "You want to talk about choices? Let's talk about yours. Let's talk about how you twist people's lives for a laugh, how you build your career on tearing others down." The stage felt smaller now, the space between them charged with hostility. Nicholas's words hung in the air, a challenge Stephen couldn't ignore. The host's eyes flickered with something darker, anger maybe, or the realization he'd pushed too far. But Stephen wasn't one to back down. He thrived on control, on bending guests to his narrative. Tonight, though, Nicholas wasn't bending. He was breaking, and the pieces were sharp. "You think you're above this?" Stephen shot back, standing. Now, his voice rising. "You think you're some tortured artist? You're a meme, Nick, a walking punchline." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment Nicholas froze, the weight of Stephen's cruelty sinking in. But then his eyes flared, and he leaned across the desk, his voice a low growl. "You're about to find out how real I can get, Stephen." Nicolas Cage's hands gripped the edge of Stephen's desk, his knuckles whitening as he loomed closer, his voice a jagged whisper that sliced through the studio's charged air. "You think you can hide behind your jokes, Stephen? You think you can tear me apart and walk away clean?" The audience held its breath, their eyes darting between the two men, sensing the moment teetering on the edge of something explosive. Stephen, still, standing, tilted his head, his lips curling into a sneer that barely masked his unease. He'd miscalculated, expecting Nicholas to crumble under the weight of his taunts. But the man before him was a live wire, sparking with defiance. The stage, once a platform for light-hearted banter, now felt like a courtroom, with Nicholas as both judge and executioner. Stephen leaned back, crossing his arms, his voice sharp and biting. "Oh, please, Nick, spare me the theatrics. You're not some misunderstood genius. You're a guy who makes bad movies and expects us to call it art." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably at the cruelty. Nicholas's eyes flashed, but he didn't retreat. He straightened, his voice steady but laced with venom. "You know what's worse than a bad movie? A man who thinks he's clever because he can mock someone else's struggle. You don't know what it takes to keep going, to put yourself out there, to fight for something you believe in." The audience erupted in scattered cheers, drawn to Nicholas's raw honesty, but Stephen waved them off, his laugh cold and dismissive. "Fight? You call those straight-to-video flops fighting? Come on, Nick, you're embarrassing yourself." The words stung, but Nicholas didn't flinch. He paced a slow circle around the desk, his movements deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. The audience leaned forward, captivated by the shift in power. Stephen's confidence wavered, his eyes tracking Nicholas's every step. "You want to talk about embarrassment?" Nicholas said, his voice rising, each word a hammer striking steel. "Let's talk about you, Stephen. Let's talk about how you invite people here, pretend to be their friend, then cut them down for a cheap laugh. You think that makes you smart? It makes you a coward." The crowd roared, some clapping, others shouting, feeding off the raw energy of Nicholas's words. Stephen's face tightened, his smirk gone, replaced by a scowl that betrayed his growing anger. Nicholas stopped pacing, facing Stephen directly, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "I've faced worse than you. I've lost everything, clawed my way back, and stood in front of cameras knowing people like you were waiting to tear me apart. And I'm still here. Can you say the same?" The question hung heavy, a challenge Stephen couldn't ignore. The host's eyes narrowed, his voice low and venomous. "You're still here because you're desperate, Nick. You'll take any role, any paycheck, just to stay relevant." The audience gasped, the brutality of the comment landing like a physical blow. Nicholas's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists, but he didn't strike. Instead, he leaned in, his voice a growl. "You don't know what desperation is, Stephen. You've never had to rebuild from nothing. You just sit here, safe in your little kingdom, throwing stones at people who dare to try." The studio felt like it was shrinking, the air thick with the weight of their words. Stephen, sensing the crowd's sympathy shifting toward Nicholas, tried to regain control. He stepped out from behind his desk, closing the distance between them, his voice sharp and mocking. "You want pity, Nick? You're not getting it. You made your choices. Live with them." But Nicholas didn't back down. He met Stephen's gaze, his eyes burning with a fire that refused to be extinguished. "I live with my choices every day," he said, his voice steady but fierce. "But you? You're going to live with this moment, Stephen. You're going to remember the night you tried to break me and failed." The audience erupted again, their cheers drowning out Stephen's attempt to respond, leaving him standing there exposed, as Nicholas held the room in his grip. The audience's roar filled the studio, a tidal wave of support crashing over Stephen, who stood frozen, his usual quick wit buried under the weight of Nicolas Cage's unyielding resolve. Nicolas didn't move, his gaze locked on Stephen, his presence commanding the room like a general on a battlefield. The host's scowl deepened, his hands twitching at his sides as he scrambled to reclaim the upper hand. "You think you're winning them over, Nick?" Stephen hissed, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You think they care about your sob story? They're here for the show, not your pity party." The words were meant to wound, to drag Nicholas back into the mud, but they only fueled the fire in his eyes. The crowd's cheers faded into a tense hum, every ear straining to catch what came next. Nicholas took a slow breath, his voice steady, but crackling with intensity. "I don't need their pity, Stephen. I need you to stop hiding behind your smug little act and face me like a man." The challenge landed like a thunderclap, the audience erupting again, some shouting Nicholas's name, others booing Stephen's cruelty. The host's face flushed, his composure cracking as he stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "You want to play tough, Nick? I'll give you tough. You're a has-been, clinging to a career that peaked 20 years ago. You're not a hero. You're a joke." The crowd gasped, the air heavy with the brutality of the attack. Stephen's words weren't just mean. They were a calculated strike, designed to shatter Nicholas's spirit in front of millions. But Nicholas didn't break. He stood taller, his voice rising like a storm-gathering strength. "A joke? I've carried films on my back while you were still cracking wise on some cable show nobody watched. I've taken risks, poured my soul into stories that matter to me while you sit here, safe, tearing down anyone who dares to dream bigger than your desk." The audience roared again, their applause a wall of sound that shook the studio. Stephen's eyes darted to the crowd, his confidence unraveling as he realized he was losing them. He tried to laugh, but it came out hollow, a weak attempt to mask his growing panic. "You're delusional, Nick," he said, his voice wavering. "You think you're some kind of legend? You're just loud." Nicholas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "I don't need to be a legend, Stephen. I just need to be honest. Something you wouldn't understand. You twist people's lives for laughs, but you're the one who's empty. You've got nothing real to say, so you attack people who do." The crowd was on its feet now, their cheers a deafening wave of support for Nicholas's raw truth. Stephen's face twisted with rage, his hands balling into fists as he struggled to respond. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, his voice shaking with anger. "You're nothing without your over-the-top stunts and your weird haircuts." The audience booed, their loyalty firmly with Nicholas, who stood unmoved, his eyes burning with quiet strength. The confrontation had reached a boiling point, the studio a pressure cooker ready to explode. Stephen, desperate to regain control, leaned in, his voice a snarl. "You're done, Nick. You walk out of here, and everyone will remember this as the night you lost it." But Nicholas didn't waver. He smiled, a slow, defiant grin that sent a chill through the room. "No, Stephen. They'll remember this as the night you showed the world who you really are. A bully who can't handle a real fight." The crowd exploded, their cheers shaking the walls as Stephen stood there, speechless, his carefully crafted persona crumbling under the weight of Nicholas's words. The stage was no longer his. It belonged to Nicholas, who stood tall, unyielding, ready to finish what Stephen had started. The studio vibrated with the audience's cheers, a roaring tide that lifted Nicolas Cage as he stood unwavering. His eyes locked on Stephen, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his own failed attack. The host's face was a mask of barely contained fury, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if it could anchor him against the storm he'd unleashed. Nicholas's words, sharp and true, had stripped away Stephen's polished veneer, leaving him exposed as the crowd chanted Nicholas's name. The air crackled with the finality of the moment, a reckoning Stephen couldn't escape. "You pushed too far, Stephen," Nicholas said, his voice calm but heavy with conviction. "You thought you could break me, but all you did was show everyone what you're made of. Nothing." Stephen's eyes flashed, his voice a desperate snarl as he tried to claw back control. "You're nobody, Nick. You're a fading star who can't handle the truth." But the words fell flat, drowned by the audience's boos, their voices a unified rejection of Stephen's venom. Nicholas shook his head, his expression a mix of pity and resolve. "The truth? The truth is, I've fought for every role, every story, every chance to create something real. You? You just tear things down because it's easy." The crowd roared again, their applause a thunderous wave that shook the room. Stephen's shoulders slumped, his usual charm replaced by a flicker of panic, as he realized the tide had turned for good. Nicholas stepped back, his voice softening but still commanding. "I came here to talk about a film I believe in, a story about a man who rises above his pain. You tried to make it about my past, my struggles, but you forgot something, Stephen. I'm not ashamed of my fight. I'm proud of it." The audience leapt. To their feet, their cheers a deafening chorus of support. Nicholas turned to them, his eyes bright with gratitude. "These people get it. They know what it means to keep going, to stand up after life knocks you down. You could learn something from them." The words hit Stephen like a blow, his face paling. As the crowd's cheers grew louder, their loyalty firmly with Nicholas. Stephen opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The host, once untouchable behind his desk, stood silenced, his cruelty laid bare for the world to see. Nicholas didn't need to say more. He'd already won. He turned to the audience, raising a hand in a gesture of thanks, his smile genuine and unbroken. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm and steady. "Thank you for reminding me why I do this." The crowd erupted, their applause a celebration of Nicholas's resilience, his refusal to bow to Stephen's taunts. The host sank into his chair, his eyes darting to the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the man he'd tried to destroy. As the segment ended, the audience remained standing, their cheers following Nicholas as he walked off the stage, his head high, his spirit unbroken. Stephen sat alone, the weight of his actions settling over him like a shadow. The cameras cut, but the moment lingered, a story of triumph that would echo beyond the studio. Nicholas had faced a bully and walked away stronger, his passion for his craft shining brighter than ever. The audience, still buzzing with excitement, knew they'd witnessed something real. A man who'd turned pain into power, leaving Stephen's cruel words in the dust. For Nicholas, it wasn't just a victory over one night's battle. It was a testament to a career built on heart, a legacy no snide comment could ever dim.